Let's loom knit a beautiful pocket scarf. Bulky yarn is needed for this scarf. Gauge isn't critical for this project, but you may like to know that I'm getting about 3.3 stitches per inch in stockinette. The specific yarn that I used is pictured here and it's discontinued, but any soft number 5 yarn will do the job. The loom should be capable of handling number 5 yarn, and it can be either a single rake. As long as there are plenty of pegs, the loom can be straight, oval, round, whatever. Or a double rake loom. I made parts of the scarf on different looms to make sure this was all possible. If your double rake loom lends itself to this, you may be able to use the no purl purling method for parts of the design, which saves a lot of wear and tear on the wrist. You will see me doing some of that in this movie that you're watching now, but if you need more detail, you can also watch this movie, which covers it more thoroughly. No purl purling actually is producing purls, but instead of us knitting the stitch backwards in the traditional way for looms, we're using the opposing board. Then when we make every stitch as a knit, because the stitches oppose one another, the ones on the second board are the opposite and are functionally purls, although we didn't do any diving for stitches and wrist twisting. We'll also be using lattice cables for the pockets and half fisherman's rib. I will show you all of those stitches as we go along, but if you need more detail on lattice cables, they are really thoroughly covered in the video you're seeing pictured on screen now, and I will put a link to the extra videos in the program notes in case you need to consult them. Half fisherman's rib is thick and soft and cushiony and very warm. It does not roll at all, but the two sides do not look identical. You're looking at them here. The side towards the right of the picture looks a lot more ribbed than the other side because of the way it's constructed. It tends to be a little wider than stockinette. The pocket back is stockinette. The pocket front is lattice cable stitch. The top of the pocket is normal knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, and above the pocket, going all the way up the body and around the neck, is half fisherman's rib. So the scarf will widen out a little bit just above the pocket, but not as much as you might think, because half fisherman's rib is such a soft fabric that the weight of the scarf will pull it downward somewhat. Here's how the work will proceed. We will cast on. I recommend using a chain stitched cast on so it's easy to match it to the bind off. Then we'll knit 6 rows of ribbing and 24 rows of lattice cable, which gets us down to what will become the fold at the bottom of the pocket. The back side of the pocket will then be knitted 36 plain stockinette rows. Then we'll work fisherman's rib for most of the length of the scarf and knit a second pocket, stockinette portion first, then lattice cable, finishing in rib and binding off. A good fit for a pocket scarf is usually achieved at equal the height of the wearer. So if you're 5 feet 4 inches tall, 64 inches is likely to be good. I suggest knitting the entire scarf to a length 2 inches shorter than the wearer when it is relaxed because of the tendency of half fisherman's rib to stretch and wear. We don't want the pockets falling at her knees. At the end of the pattern, there is a summary showing suggested row counts and total measurements, so you don't have to commit all this to memory right now. This portion of the movie is just to help you visualize where we're going. If you're going to be using a single row of pegs, whether they are in the round, oval, or straight as on this loom, I suggest doing the chain stitch cast on. And you could definitely use a crochet hook for this, but I'm enjoying using a latch tool. This is really a machine knitting tool, and you can get a bulky one from any machine knitting supplier. It just fits between the pegs so nicely as compared to a crochet hook. And using the chain stitch cast on is a better match than almost anything else for the way we're usually going to bind off. Using this kind of loom configuration, the traditional way of making ribbing is what I'm showing you. I'm knitting with a U-stitch. Any form of knit stitch that you prefer that comes out the right size for you is fine. And then every other stitch, instead of being knitted using any kind of knit stitch whatsoever, is purled by reaching down through, pulling up a new loop, and replacing it on the peg. If you're going to use no purl type ribbing on a double knitting board, you may want to try an alternate cast on. Here I'm doing the figure 8. I do this because I am not all that satisfied with the results I get trying to do a chain stitch cast on a double board. If you have a good way of doing it, you certainly may, but I'll show you what I'll do to finish this in a moment. Take note that the kind of ribbing I'm using here is knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, so the board is wrapped as close to directly across as the pegs are situated. I've got my boards arranged so that the pegs actually alternate, so I'm just zigzagging across when I wrap. Now that the knitting has emerged from the bottom of the loom, I can show you how I would finish it. The loops from the figure 8 make rather long loops, long enough to chain them together in order, which makes a reasonably good match for a chain stitch bind off. If your stockinette gauge is like mine, cast on 25 stitches. My gauge is 3.33 stitches per inch exactly. Here are some alternate numbers based on your stitch gauge being 2, 3, 4, or 5 per inch. And these numbers will give you a pocket that's 7.5 inches wide, as mine is. Or you may figure your own stitch count, but make sure it's an odd number. We'll work from stockinette gauge. There's no need to record the gauge of each fabric that we knit. Now we'll knit 6 rows of ribbing, whether you're doing it the traditional way, as I'm doing on the left, or using no purl ribbing, as I'm doing on the right. At the gauge that I'm getting, we knit 6 rows. The goal is about 1.5 inches of ribbing. So if you're getting a different gauge completely, just knit 1.5 inches of ribbing. After the 6 rows of ribbing, we changed to lattice stitch. For me, that involved taking the stitches all off of the double board setup and stretching them out along the single board. That's the downside to trading around using the single versus the double board. Sometimes you can't go straight across. Had I been using every other peg for the ribbing, I could have just transferred everything towards myself. But in this case, I had the closer spacing of the pegs alternating, so I took them all off on a circular needle that was designed for hand knitting, stretched them out along that needle, and rehung every loop on my board. The lattice stitch consists of 4 rows, and we're working the first one here from right to left. Slip the first stitch, but knit every other one across. That's very slightly different from the version shown in the video pictured upper right, only in that we're not making an edge to make it non-roll, so there isn't a tucked purl stitch. Row 1, moving right to left, is slip the first stitch but knit every other one, and note that I'm using an around the corner peg here. This is a specially made Cindy wood loom for me. It only has 24 pegs per side, but it does have those insertable, removable spacers with pegs on the ends. Row 2 moves left to right. Slip the first stitch and knit the second one, but don't include it in a lattice cable. Knit the next 2 stitches, then pick up the one that began on the right and move it to the left. It's almost impossible for me to keep my hands out of your way, so here is some help. These are the 2 stitches that were just knitted. Lift them off of their pegs. You can even use the pegs on the opposing board to hold them temporarily. Now take the one that is on the right or began on the right and move it to the left peg. And take the one from the left and move it to the right peg. It's likely that during this process the stitches will grow, so take the yarn supply and tug it gently to bring them back to snug. But do not over tighten. It's not desirable for this stitch to be very tight. The pegs should not be stressed, nor should the yarn. On row 2, there should be 2 pegs with stitches on them at the end of the row that get knitted but do not get crossed. Then we're ready for row 3, which is exactly like row 1. We slip the first stitch and knit all the way across. Row 4 is another cable cross row. It's very similar to row 2. We slip the first stitch, but here's the first difference. We knit the next 2. There is no extra knit stitch that isn't a part of the cable pattern at the beginning of row 4. So we slip stitch 1, knit stitches 2 and 3, lift them, cross them, and here's the second thing. We cross left over right. That is replacing the stitch that began on the left on the right first, and then the stitch that began on the right on the left. The fact that rows 2 and rows 4 have these alternations is what makes the lattice pattern. The first alternation being which exact stitches we cross by leaving one stitch a plain knit at the beginning versus at the end of each row. And the second alternation being right over left versus left over right. This is left over right when the left one is replaced first. At the very end of row 4, when we get to the last 3 pegs that hold stitches, knit the first and second, cross them, and then the very last peg will get knitted without being part of the pattern. We began here, knitted 6 rows of ribbing, or in a different gauge, however many rows made 1.5 inches. Now we want to knit 24 rows of the lattice pattern that I just demonstrated. That will make the outside of the pocket. And of course, if you're getting quite a different gauge, work the lattice pattern in your gauge until the lattice section is 6 inches long. From here we move on to stockinette. It will be the back of the pocket. Knit 36 rows of it, or however many rows gets you to a 7.5 inch pocket. So to be clear, we've already made a 7.5 inch front pocket. We're making a 7.5 inch back of the pocket now. The pocket is pretty much square. It's also 7.5 inches wide, but we determine that by choosing the stitch count. Here we are determining the length. You can use whatever version of the knit stitch suits you to make the back of the pocket. Now we move on to half fisherman's rib, which is most of the length of the scarf. Here I'm working on the Kiss Dragon loom. So I've wrapped an entire row. I'm knitting every other stitch using the normal Kiss version of the U-stitch. Then half fisherman's rib is created with tucked purls for every other stitch. I'm slipping the first stitch and purling the next stitch off 2 loops together. That's the tucked purl. Wrapping the next stitch, I'll come back and knit it in a moment, purling off 2 loops together and knitting off the stitch I wrapped. And it goes on across like that on a Kiss loom. Here's the same process using the single board method on a Cindy wood loom. This would also be true of any single rake loom, even if the rake was bent into an oval or a circle. Row 1 is knit every other stitch and allow a loop to build up on the intervening pegs. Row 2 is slip the first stitch, then purl 2 loops together, knit, purl 2 loops together on across. If you're able to do this on a double knitting board and the pegs are alternating, this is what it looks like. I still have 25 stitches. Both end stitches, the outer edge stitches, are on the front board. The front board is going to be my knit stitches. So every single row that I wrap, those get knitted over. For that row, a pair of loops is building up on the back board, and they will be purled off on the second row. But I won't have to twist my wrist to do the purling and dive down and pick up loops, because since the stitches are made in the opposing direction from one another, the ones on the back board will be purls. Just as on the single board, the double board version is cushiony, thick, and non-rolling. It does involve knits and purls. This is just the alternate way of making those knits and purls. I always knit off the end stitch first to hold what I'm doing, then knit across my front board stitches, which are knit stitches and are knitted every row, then address the back board and knit 2 loops over one, and these 2 rows are the entire half fisherman's rib pattern on a double knitting board setup. In general, a pocket scarf fits the wearer well if it roughly equals her height. As explained before, we're going to knit to 2 inches shorter to account for drop, and the pockets add up to 15 inches total. So beginning at the left of the diagram, we knitted the first section of ribbing, the first section of lattice, the back of the pocket. Now we've just finished knitting up this way. So we need to knit the back of the second pocket now. That's 36 more stockinette rows, or whatever number you knitted for the first pocket. Next, 24 more lattice cable rows, or your personal number to match the first pocket. And finish with 6 ribbing rows, or again, your personal row count. And bind off using a chain stitch method. Using the double board ribbing, I chain 1 stitch through the next. Using single board ribbing, I usually lift on a crochet hook and work a new chain stitch with the yarn through each stitch in a row. What you're looking at now is a brief demonstration, sped up of course, of me getting ready to change from the long half fisherman's rib section to the back for the second pocket. There are 25 stitches, but because I used both boards, they are parallel on the loom, not stretched out, and they need to get stretched out. I cannot, however, lift the end one and move it all the way to the end peg that I need to use without unduly straining the stitches, so I'm doing it in stages. It's a little bit of a bother, but I have saved so much wear and tear on my hands by using the double board method for that long half fisherman's rib section that I really didn't mind doing it. Because I'm going back to single knitting and I need 25 pegs, although each of these boards only has 24, I am using one of the end peg inserts to get my 25th stitch, and that works just fine. Now I can resume knitting, plain knitting, in other words stockinette, for the 36 rows needed for the back pocket. The lattice cable is also a single board stitch, so I will do that in this same configuration. I have the choice whether to work the ribbing on a single board or to shift back. When everything is done to finish the scarf, all we have to do is fold between the stockinette section and the lattice section. That will create the pocket bottom, and then these 2 edges will align and be sewn together. Do so on both sides and your scarf is done. The position of the seams is marked with dotted lines on the right-hand photo. I'm putting a few links for you in the program notes. One concerns the loom, which was custom made for me by Cindy Wood, and I give you the specifications in case that interests you. Also, my YouTube loom knitting playlist and the part of my website that concerns loom knitting. Also, these 2 videos because they relate to the techniques and the loom used in this video.